Last week, we looked predominantly at geological prehistory, what science knows and what the Bible tells us about creation, and how the earths appeared among the waters to produce continents. And tonight we want to move to life, the question of life on earth. We are told in Genesis that when God created the first people, he himself breathed the breath of life into them and made them living creatures. We don't have any truly meaningful data on how life began in the earliest living things that were produced on our planet. What we do know is some of the qualities that had to exist before life could happen. And we'll look at that. As soon as I figure out how to advance the slide. Here's what Genesis says about life. And God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind upon the earth. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the firmament of the heavens. So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature with which the waters swarm, and God saw that it was good. Here's what we know of the qualities that life requires. Life requires protection. It requires adaptation, because we know that over the millions of years that some forms of life have existed, adaptation became essential because of the dramatic ways in which the environment changed. And then there's a questionable essential called tropism. Tropism is the attraction to something useful or the retreat from something harmful. And more than a regular feature of laboratory experiments, it's more from watching nature. A moth will be attracted to a flame, but the smart ones will veer off before they get burned, and so forth. An essential in all of this story is the acquisition and use of energy. And the words that go with that are the assimilation of matter and energy, which is called anabolism, the breaking down of it to release energy, which is called catabolism, and both of those phenomena together produce metabolism. And although metabolism looks very differently among different forms of life, it is in fact an essential of any living creature. And growth is also an essential of any living creature. And reproduction by a variety of methods is also a characteristic essential of life. As I said at the beginning of this visual, what began all this is not scientifically clear, but biblically it is clear. God created it. Now, you're going to have to bear with me a little bit. My biochemistry genes are all in full shot right now, and I simply can't resist a little bit of biochemistry throwing at you. So be patient and forgiving, please. All of the life that we know anything about is based on the element carbon. It is number 12 in the atomic chart, unless it's radioactive, and then it's number 14. The carbon is arguably the most interesting atom that exists. Certainly for organic life on Earth it is. It has a unique combining capacity. It can combine at 4 points on the atom, and that makes it the most versatile element of all biochemical forms. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it can either be stable, that is carbon-12, or radioactive, which is carbon-14. And there are also examples of carbon-10 and 11, but they're not very important in life, so we're not going to talk about them. Carbon bonds with practically every other element, including itself, and depending on what it's combined with and the state of that combination, it can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas, or sometimes a simultaneous combination of the two. So I want you to leave this visual with an understanding that carbon is really important to you, and you should be very grateful for it. All right, let's look a little bit of our timeline.
What?
Our planet is approximately 5 billion years old. Depending on which account you read and some trivial arguments that are going on, it varies from about 4.2 billion to about 5.2 billion. But what's a few billion years at this point in the game? The earliest life forms that we know anything about, and this is largely, of course, from the fossil record, seem to have appeared about 4.1 billion years ago. And importantly, and I'll come back to this point in a moment, photosynthetic plants appeared about 3 billion years ago. This is arguably the most significant event that has happened to the biological world that we know. For one thing, the increasing loss of photosynthetic plants on our planet is endangering all life on our planet. Complex cells, that is, we call them eukaryotes. Basically, this means cells whose genetic information is enclosed inside a cellular body, which we call the nucleus. So the word eukaryote means true nuclei, and they appeared about 2 billion years ago. But these were single-celled lives. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And then about 1 billion years ago, we saw the first multicellular life. Now, back to a little bit of biochemistry. This is going to be on the exam, I promise you. The process by which plants convert sunlight energy into chemical energy is the process that we called photosynthesis. And that's where the name comes from. The energy is stored in carbohydrates, either simple or very complex sugars. And remember that all starches, no matter how complex they are basically complex sugars. This process, the process of photosynthesis, fixes carbon dioxide, converts that carbon dioxide into chemical energy stored in carbohydrates, and then releases oxygen as a waste product, for which we are all extremely lucky. The essential molecule in this process is called chlorophyll. It's a molecule which exists in all green plants. Chlorophyll is essential for photosynthesis. It is the chemical molecule which presides over the conversion process. And without photosynthesis, no life would exist on our planet in the way that we understand it. However, not all living things photosynthesize, and not all living things are completely carbon-based. And I'll just show you a few examples. On the far left of your screen is a bacterium, sort of a very, very primitive plant, which lives even today in volcanic vents. And instead of using oxygen and carbon dioxide to carry out its energy reactions, it uses cyanide and releases nitrogen into the water. One of the simplest carbon-based compounds that we know of is methane. It's a gas, and it's, as we know, it's a poisonous gas. It is simply a carbon atom with a hydrogen atom at each of its loci. But there are bacteria that live by breaking down methane and releasing water. And then we have Diplonais. Diplonais is a diatom, a very, very small creature, and its structure is not carbon, but one of carbon's closest chemical relatives, namely silicon. And of course, we usually encounter silicon as a form of silicon dioxide, which is what we call sand. There are also organisms that live on and break down organic matter, such as Escherichia coli, who can either be a good organism or a very dangerous pathogen. And there are viruses that prey on bacteria. They're called bacterium eaters or bacteriophages. And this is an example in the center bottom of the screen of a bacteriophage, which is a parasite for Escherichia coli, for E. coli. And then finally, we have Saccharomyces, which we know is common brewer's yeast. Without it, there would be no beer, no whiskey. You think, okay, that's all right. No bread, and not a lot of other things that are important to us. Back to the Bible. And God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind upon the earth. That's verse 11 of Genesis 1. Well, that brings me to another little chemistry lesson. As I've already told you, I can't resist. And this is a little something called the Central Dogma of Molecular Biology. Isn't that a wonderful title? And it means that DNA is the data bank for every feature that any living organism has. That data bank, in order to be utilized, has to have 3 subcomponents. Now, DNA is, of course, deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA is ribonucleic acid, and they get their names from the peculiar sugar that is a component of each of their molecules. DNA is deoxyribose. RNA is ribose. There are 3 forms of RNA essential to a living cell. One is responsible for a phenomenon called translation. It means that the information that exists in DNA is translated into a mobile molecule, a message called messenger RNA, which is a blueprint molecule. Messenger RNA lines up with 2 other forms of RNA. And once those 3 forms of RNA are lined up, they synthesize a protein, and protein molecules are the worker bees of a living cell. And because DNA, with some exceptions, in healthy organisms is a constant, the same genetic information goes through this process every time. And as Genesis 1 tells us, each according to its kind. Now, here are some examples of plants with chlorophyll. In the upper left of your screen is a simple green algae called chlorella. Chlorella is a really interesting, although a simple looking living plant. It's single-celled, but it grows in carpet-like masses in marine water, and for older, somewhat more primitive civilizations, it was a major food group. And during World War II in South America, they actually set up huge vats to grow chlorella as a protein source because they thought that the war was going to endanger the Western world's food supply. Chlorella is still used as a food, as I've already said, in some island civilizations, and it is a very, very good food. It is full of vitamins, full of fiber, and full of protein. The bottom left of your screen is probably the next evolutionary step up from algae, of which chlorella is an example. This is a moss. Mosses are in and of themselves extraordinarily interesting plants. They are in fact a biplant. Mosses are generally a symbiotic combination of algae and a fungus, but they are stable. They breed stably by spores. They are called bryophytes, and they're common. You can turn over any damp rock and you will see moss on it. But when you see a moss, you're not looking at one plant. You are always looking at 2. And then on the right side of your screen is our next evolutionary step up. This is a fern. A fern is a more advanced form of our bryophyte group. They reproduce by spores. They are light necessary, which means that they are photosynthetic. They have highly specialized roots, some of which take CO2 actually out of the air and convert it into carbohydrate energy. We think of them as being beautiful houseplants, and they are, but they're also an essential step on the evolution of plant life into what Genesis 1 first promised us, that is, seed-bearing plants that produce the same plant that produced the seed, which is basically the story of DNA. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about animals. I'm not going to show you a picture of it because I didn't find one that I thought was good enough. But the first animal we think that we know anything about, and there are still versions of it that can be found now in swamp water. It was called euglena. And the thing about euglena is that it is both a plant and an animal in one single cell creature. It has a cell membrane, which is characteristic of animal cells. It has a flagellum that is a means of locomotion that is typical of animal cells, but it gets its energy by the activation of sunlight on chlorophyll. So it is truly a one-cell creature that is part plant and part animal in one creature. The only such creature that we know of in all the world, although there is ample speculation that in very, very early life, there may have been more creatures that were like euglena, but either they died out to be replaced by other life forms, or they made an evolutionary choice to be either a plant or an animal. And of course, since they left no fossil record, we can only speculate about the reality of that idea. Then, with all of the enormous overgrowths of vegetation in the world, the age of reptiles began. The age of reptiles lasted for many millions of years. And with the possible exception of the Arctic and Antarctica, there is no place on Earth where fossil records of reptiles have not been found. So they literally covered the world in their time, and they lasted for millions of years. They occurred in many forms. There were reptiles that were probably no more than 3 or 4 inches long. And there were reptiles that weighed 100 tons. As far as the fossil record indicates, the first reptiles were almost certainly herbivores. That is to say, they existed by living on green plants. Their digestive systems were inhabited by bacteria, which helped them break down the fibers of green plants. And because of the enormous plenitude of green plants during the time of these herbivore reptiles, there were opportunities for some of them to grow very, very large. And of course, when these giant reptiles came back to us with the help of Steven Spielberg, the fascination that has never gone away about them has most certainly increased them, so that every kid now can talk to you about a brontosaurus or a tyrannosaurus or whatever. On the heels of the proliferation of these plant-eating dinosaurs came other dinosaurs that ate the plant-eating dinosaurs. There are many, and again, most any elementary school kid now can tell you what a velociraptor is, or a Tyrannosaurus Rex, or whatever, because of Steven Spielberg. And yet, they were important creatures that lived for millions of years in their time and occurred all over the world. So reptiles truly dominated the life form until about 66 million years ago. And then one of the great dramas of Earth's prehistory occurred. It's called the Cretaceous Tertiary event. And if you look up an abbreviation, you won't see CT, because CT has another important medical meaning. It's called the KT, but it means Cretaceous Tertiary event. And it's believed to be the impact of a very, very large asteroid. And there are theories about where that asteroid struck. One of the most popular one being somewhere deep in central Mexico, but we really don't know that for sure. But whatever happened, it caused a dust cloud that actually hovered over the Earth and cut out most of the sun for thousands of years, in fact, or at least hundreds of years, destroying the food supply so that the plant-eating dinosaurs all died. And as a result of that, the dinosaurs that ate the plant-eating dinosaurs all died. So the age of reptiles came to an end about 65.5 or 66 million years ago. This is just a reiteration of what I've already said. But the second part of this visual turns out to be important. The fossil record shows at least two major branches of the dinosaur or the saurian family. One branch is the pre-reptilian branch, and the other branch is the pre-avian branch. Modern reptiles, and you think about what modern reptiles are, we basically have crocodiles, caimans, alligators, snakes, and lizards. And they are all descendants of the pre-reptilian group. But probably more common, and perhaps a little surprising to some of us, there's a pre-avian dinosaur. It is now being clearly understood that there was a whole branch of the saurian family that did not have scales on their skins at all. In fact, they had feathers. And these pre-avian dinosaurs are the ancestors of all modern birds. So when you look at your feeder and you see this precious living cardinal or this precious little sparrow or a blackbird or whatever, you're looking at a modern dinosaur descendant. And for sealbird fans like me, I think that's really cool. And now we get to a little closer to home. Let's talk for a little bit about primates. Primates appeared pretty early in prehistory. One of the oldest primates that we know about is Lucy. You know, Lucy is fairly famous. There are books about Lucy. Several years ago, we traveled to the Houston Museum of Natural Science to see a Lucy exhibit. And I have to tell you, I stood looking through the plexiglass at this tiny creature, about 3 feet tall, nothing but bones, although there was a reproduction of her standing close by. It made me cry, because this was a creature that did not become us, but she was clearly on the road to us. She walked on 2 feet and she stood erect. So she was a bipedal primate. Her official name is Australopithecus afarensis, which basically translates to southern ape from Africa. Where she is on the branched pathway of primate evolution is still not absolutely clear, but she was there and is a part of primate prehistory. Further down the line, sometime between 10 and 8 million years ago, the genus Homo appeared. That's our genus. We'll say more about that in a moment. But the genus Homo suddenly changed everything about primate prehistory. There was a major break-off between Homo and the genus most closely associated with it, that is the genus Pan. The genus Pan contains chimpanzees and bonobos. And although there may be those among you who don't want to hear this, we share about 90% of the same DNA with bonobos. It's that 10% that makes all the difference, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going back instead of forward. Okay, now here's what the Bible says about this from Genesis 1. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And that is all from Genesis 1. One of the things that this has done is when we put God into our mind's eye, what do we see? We tend to see a kindly old, very human, sort of ultimate grandpa. So, with Genesis telling us that God made us in his image, we are sort of making him over in our image so that he can be someone that we can better relate to. And I personally don't think that's a bad thing at all. Okay, let's get back to our ancestors. As we said, Homo broke off from its closest relative, Pan, at some point very early. And the first human ancestor that we can really identify from the fossil record, we have called Homo habilis. That translates to handyman. And the reason that this species of our genus gets this name is because his bones have always been found in the presence of crude but clearly constructed tools. They are hide scrapers, choppers, and awls, that is, things to punch holes with. Other than bones and tools, we don't have any clear record of what Homo habilis made with them, but we can speculate as to what those tools could have been used for. Scrapers could have been used for making hides, for shelter or for clothing. Axes, certainly for chopping, probably not wood, but bones, so that the very protein-rich marrow and fat could be sucked out of those bones. The awls, not sure about that. There's a suggestion that they were used to make some sort of clothing, but no clothing has survived, so we don't know. What we do know is from dating of those artifacts, Homo habilis lived about 2.5 million years ago. Somewhere during that same time frame, another species of our genus appeared, Homo erectus. Homo erectus, as the name implied, was fully bipedal, walked upright, had very well-defined opposing thumbs. His hands were large and bony, but facile, and could be used. Whether or not Homo erectus had fire is a subject of some disagreement, but I think most Studiers of the antiquities now think that Homo erectus was probably the first of our genus to have fire, because some of the bones that have been found with them appeared to have been charred. Homo erectus was a very venturous and widely traveled person. The fossil record shows him all over Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And Homo erectus was probably the first member of our genus to cross over into what we now would think of as Israel and China. And some of these countries have their own version of Homo erectus. You can see references to Peking man. You can see references to Heidelberg man, and on and on. But they all track back to this adventurous, advanced, and almost certainly competent member of our ancestry. Our species, Homo sapiens, which means thinking man, arrived somewhere between 0.8 and 0.3 million years ago. And like most other evolutionary pathways, our pathway is not a straight line, but there are several branches along the way. And I just want to talk about one of those branches right now, and that's to clear up some very common misunderstandings of him. One is Neanderthal man, named because his fossil record was first discovered in the Neanderthal Valley in what is now Germany. The first Neanderthal fossil found in a cave was hugely malformed. He was bent, clearly suffered from scoliosis, and had almost certainly been injured. But because of that, he first got the incorrect name of ape man, largely because of the shape of that first diseased fossil. What they could not understand was that in the same cave where they found the first burials of Neanderthal man, they found evidence of burial objects, tools. There were even some fossilized seeds and what appeared to be flowers in those graves. And it was first assumed that they were put there later by someone else. It is now understood that Neanderthal man was a thinking creature. And he's been redesignated in the past several years as Homo sapiens neanderthalis, and is considered a very close relative of ours, that is to say, Homo sapiens. Our most direct ancestor, though, also named for the area where he was found, is Cro-Magnon man. Cro-Magnon man appears to be our most direct ancestor. He was upright, strong, muscular. He had a nose very much like modern noses. He did not have a protruding brow line. He had a very modern skull. A Cro-Magnon skull looks exactly like a modern human skull. And as a matter of fact, one commentator said, if you dress a Cro-Magnon man or woman in a suit or a dress and put him on the street of any city in the country, he would look like everybody else. Well, there are people who might say the same thing about Neanderthal man, but we're not going to get into that. But the idea is that our evolution, to just reiterate, is not a straight line. It is more, quite literally, a family tree with branches. Some of those branches bisected years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, some of them much more recently. We carry in our own DNA about 6% of DNA in common with Neanderthals, which is kind of interesting in a way because we have genetically a smaller relationship with another member of genus Homo than we do with the very separate genus Pan right now. But what that suggests is that for whatever reason, Neanderthal man and Cro-Magnon man rarely, if ever, interbred. So once Cro-Magnon man appeared, the lineage is much more direct from them than it is from any other member of the genus Homo. Now, I want to end with something of a political opinion, but it is also a biological fact. There is no genetic basis for racial distinctions. The differences in the appearance of various peoples in the world, for example, the difference between African Americans, Chinese, Mongolians, Vietnamese, or Caucasians from wherever they are, Native Americans, these differences are phenotypic, which means that they're a part of our appearances, but they are not genetic. As far as we know, there are no living humans on the planet today that cannot have children with each other, which means that our DNA is completely compatible. The differences that we see are the result of centuries of local environments, local dietary habits, and a degree of geographic inbreeding. And I'll end our session tonight with one quick examples. All genes for skin color in all living people are exactly the same, but they are multiple, and their degree of expression, whether they're black, brown, yellow, or white, is influenced by years of environmental change. For example, in Africa and in the desert where the sun beat down so, more genes for skin color, for dark skin color, emerged because it was protective and therefore phenotypically selective for those people, but it's still the same genes. Our expression is different from African Americans or from the Chinese, but it is the difference in the expression of the very same genes. So race is a construct, and there is no, I repeat, no genetic basis for it at all, ever. And with that, I will thank you once again for joining me. And with luck,
Get out of your screen.
I'll see you again next week.